Thank you, Mr. Anilji. I want to share the screen. Actually, can I share the screen, please?
Yes, yes.
Okay. So before actually it starts working, let me thank Dr. Ambarish Rai for persuading me actually to come onto the panel and discuss some of my ideas. Though these ideas are slightly outdated, probably I think needs a bit of refreshment. But still, I thought let me discuss a few issues, present before you a few questions, and seek to elicit some feedback actually on and discussion on those issues. The topic that was decided on the eve of Bhimrao Ambedkar's anniversary is quite relevant and interesting actually. So some of these discourses are basically have marked the recent past in the sense that for the past few decades or so. The discourse on equity, the discourse on exclusions, the discourses on inequalities, social justice, fairness in terms of education, began to be the mainstay of discourses in education till the point that the pandemic struck us. But I think all these issues continue to be valid and rather more important actually in the context of pandemic. But if you look at the larger ideal of equity and social justice, the constitutional goal and the cherished ideal of any civilized society is to attain certain level of equity and social justice among its populations. But at the same time, we cannot deny the fact that all societies, whether civilized or not so civilized, or developing or developed, continue to have the injustices, unfairness, inequalities, which tend to sort of pull down actually the entire ideal of achieving social justice and equity within the society. So therefore, this idea of inclusiveness and equity assumes actually a greater relevance within such kind of a context. The social ideal of just largely, I think, because the social structures are unequal, the larger onus of maintaining and providing for equity and social justice falls squarely upon the state, and therefore the role of the state in framing the policies as well as practicing those policies within the national context also assume actually very, very important role. But as we will see, I think in the next few minutes, I think, the very state seemed to be assuming actually the role of perpetuator and, agent of reproduction of those very same inequalities, which it actually is expected to mitigate. So there is actually a kind of contradiction and there is a kind of inconsistency in the way the policies seem to be addressing the idea of education for all or the right to education. So I'm actually taking right to education as the basic framework within which I look at the idea of equity and social justice. So because I think the forum actually itself actually calls me to bring attention to the idea of the right to education, something actually which we very happily achieved during the first 2 decades of this new millennium. So therefore, I will try and focus actually myself to ask certain questions like why do we need to discuss inequalities in and through education? and how do varying political and economic contexts give or gave rise to varied consequences. Um, I think the screen seemed to have gone actually. Uh, the first question I would like to ask is that why do we need to discuss these inequalities in and through education, and how do varying social, political, and economic contexts give rise to varied consequences in educational scenarios? What have been the existing differences and marginalities in the site of education that seem to acquire new connotations, forms, and effects over time and in different epochs within the short period of my analysis, that is the first 2 decades of the new. So actually, just to kind of give you the idea, the structure of my presentation is to ask a few questions. How do we need to discuss inequalities in and through education?
Sita, can you request Srinivasa Rao to send email to you, and you share the screen and he can speak?
Sure.
Let me finish the presentation. Maybe I think I can send it later. But just I think let us just do it away. Probably I think I'll.
She can she can share if you send right now. She can share the screen.
No, I think we'll leave it now. I think because it'll spoil the time. Actually, maybe I think the other speakers also need to speak, so I'll not waste their time. So, the second question which we would like to look at actually is what have been the existing differences and marginalities in the site of education that seem to acquire new connotations, forms, and effects over time and in different epochs. How do we understand policy inconsistencies and contradictions or threats that further widen the inequalities? If you actually look at these first 2 decades of the new millennium in terms of the policy change and the resultant shift in the realities of education, I made a very, very artificial kind of 3-phase kind of analysis, which would help us to identify specific kind of developments that have taken place during those 3 periods. And that actually will allow us to analyze the issue of equity or inequity within a particular kind of a context. The first is the period from the year 2001 to 2013, which is mostly neoliberal, market-driven policy framework, which also saw improvements in infrastructure for education, enrollments, and some kind of consciousness and demand for education at all levels. The second phase actually, which I may refer to is the period from 2014 to 2019, where there has been a continued neoliberal thrust accompanied by neoconservative cultural homogenization that diluted the gains that were accrued in the first phase of neoliberal era. I will highlight and produce actually certain kind of data, I think, through my own study, which was conducted in 2017, how it actually has diluted actually the gains that were accrued in the first phase of neoliberal, policy. I'm not saying that the first phase was a very successful phase. Actually, it had its own problems, which I will also present before you. The third phase, actually, which we may classify the period actually from 2020 onwards, which is struck by pandemic, the new market dynamism in terms of online education, and the collapse of school as an institution and an imagination. The very idea of school itself actually as an imagination seemed to have collapsed. So these are the 3 different kinds of phases which I would actually place before you. And this is not a very hard and fast kind of classification of the period of the past 2 decades. But for the analytical purposes, I thought actually this would help us a bit actually in terms of identifying the issues. So let me take the phase one, actually the first phase of the neoliberal, the first 2 decades, where there have been, as I mentioned, have been tremendous amount of achievements in terms of elementary education. One can always actually look at the hard figures and then see that the number of primary schools have increased by 34.5%. Upper primary schools have increased by an whopping 185.9%, and secondary and higher secondary schools by 71.4%. It's actually not specific to the elementary, but also actually transcending to the other levels of education in the school sector. So therefore, there has been a tremendous amount of growth that actually one can witness between 2001 and 2013. About 98% of rural habitations are serviced by a primary school within a distance of 1 kilometer. So actually, this is another gain actually during that period. Yet another gain actually is that the net enrollment ratio has improved, particularly in the primary education, has improved to 88.1%. And moreover, actually, you can also see, if you look at the DICE reports and the statistical compilations which came post 2016 or so, that there have been substantial increase in GERs, gross enrollment ratios in elementary education, of children from disadvantaged population groups like Dalits, tribes, minority communities, and children with special needs. This is all between the period 2001 and 2013. And yet another very significant measure of the improvement, actually one can see, is the improvement in the gender parity index in primary education, which has improved from 0.79 in 2004-05 to 1. Actually, it's almost equal, actually, so in 2013-14. So I request actually participants to unmute, actually. Mute. Yeah. So I think, you can also see the similar kind of a trend in upper primary level, where I think it has even crossed more than 1 in terms of gender parity index. It has actually moved from 0.75 in 2004-05 to almost 1.08 actually in 2013. So I think you can look at actually, and that actually gets reflected even in the secondary and higher secondary levels as well. And I think, if I may be allowed to say, that actually has even percolated to higher education. Cross enrollment ratios during this particular period has witnessed tremendous increase even in higher education, from almost 7 to 8 actually in 2001 to something like almost 21% actually of the gross enrollment ratio in higher education. So therefore, I think across all levels, the first 13 years of the new millennium, and which is also a period when the actual policies that were framed post-liberalization in 1990s began to show certain kind of effect. And that initial phase also marked certain kind of investment in social sector, including education. So there is actually a kind of improvement which we can witness during those. And yet another, actually, in terms of policy and practice, the biggest achievement was in terms of framing and enactment of right to education, which got culminated into the enactment in 2009, and then actually began to be implemented from April 2010. And there were various other kinds of policy frameworks for teacher education, teacher recruitments, early childcare and education, Anganwadis, everything. Actually, there's so many changes which are simultaneously addressed and brought out in the policy realm, and therefore I think certain kind of changes in the practices as well. And there was also during this period, actually up till say the right to education began to be implemented, there has been an enhanced role for civil society organizations, which actually also one of the contributory factors for increasing the demand for education at the primary level. So there is actually a kind of a gain. However, as I mentioned, I'm not saying that all was well during that period. One can always see the results of the census 2011, where one can see at the bottom of the graded inequalities in terms of literacy, you find rural, female, scheduled tribe at the bottom. Over and above, actually, them lie in kind of a graded fashion moving upwards: rural female scheduled caste, rural female non-SC/ST, rural male scheduled caste, rural male scheduled tribe, urban female scheduled tribe, urban female scheduled caste, rural male non-SC/ST, urban female non-SC/ST, urban male ST. So I think you at the highest level of the pyramid is the urban male non-SC/ST. So you can see how the graded inequalities in literacy continue to exist even in the year 2011, in spite of a huge gain actually that was achieved during the period. You can also see the DICE data clearly gives us actually the data about the dropouts, lack of retention of children in schools. 67 children out of 100 only reach the grade 5. The corresponding figure for rural and urban areas are 64 and 83. Urban areas are not actually doing as well. Actually, you still have 17% of the dropouts. So you find actually that the dropout continues to be a serious concern. I'm not talking about what Ambarish was referring to, the quality education for all. So that I think, is a distant dream. I think I'm basically looking at the idea of access, because the right to education is very, very important in terms of the idea of access, and why that remained, actually right to education remained a sort of unfinished ideal and goal. And I think, as we will see, I think, how it was made to fizzle out as soon as it actually has been enacted. We can see actually that. So the empirical studies also conducted during this period of 2001 and 2013 have clearly come out with these conclusions that the patterns of social inequality of both access and completion have multiple bases in the structural conditions, which are continuously evolving in interaction with the multiple factors, and that there has been an evidence of growing incidence of poverty, rising levels of mortality and illness, rising levels of rural unemployment and wage squeeze. So maybe I think one may refer to the period of 2001 to 2013 as a period of opportunity and growth in economy, all that. But still, I think the micro studies seem to be coming out with a number of these kinds of factors as well. I think there is also declining levels of consumption shares, real wages, consumer monthly per capita expenditure among the scheduled caste in particular. So while there has been an increasing trend of migration towards the city, you also find that these are also taking place in the Indian society simultaneously. I think one can see actually that is where it's a kind of a context is very, very contradictory, and sort of it presents actually both the kind of dimensions of hope as well as despair. What the second phase actually did was, whatever these minimal or achievements that were seen actually during the phase one of the first 2 decades is that the dilution, the state began to dilute its own policies, thereby creating a sort of a perfect market condition, which obviously disprivileged the poor and the disadvantaged. So this is actually the mark of the second phase. How does this happen? How did this happen? I take recourse to one of the reports of the Right to Education Forum itself. In, I think, 2013 or 2014 or 15, I think one of the reports of Right to Education pointed out that a large number of schools in various states of India, something like 80,647 schools were either merged or closed down till 2014. And this is happening within the first 4 years of the implementation of the right to education. The actual number, the total number of schools which are closed down, I think crossed more than 1 lakh during the period from 2014 onwards till 2019. So we don't have the specific number, exact number, but I think you can see that the states where this idea of school closures had affected are all those states which have had the literacy rates lower than the national average. You take actually the case of Odisha, Telangana, Rajasthan, actually all these states which are actually lesser than the national literacy rate, lower than the national average, or the female literacy lower than the national average. And you find actually in Rajasthan in particular, during that particular period in 2014-15, one finds actually that something like 20,000 schools are closed, which is almost actually these primary schools. All the schools are primary schools I'm referring to, not the upper primary or higher secondary or secondary schools. So these many schools, in the case of Rajasthan, out of something like 32,000 primary schools that were existing, almost 20,000 schools are closed down in the name of merger, in the name of improvement, in the name of rationalization of teacher deployment, whatnot. I mean, you have created actually a situation which is which has led to a huge this comes out actually with different kinds of names. In some states call it mergers because they're merging the schools which are economically unviable, which are very, very small schools. So therefore, the smaller the number of children in a particular school, that actually is called for the closure because the teacher is vested in such small schools, and therefore the teacher is taken out of that school and put in another school, so that, and expected actually that these children where the school is being closed will be taken to the school where the teacher will be redeployed, and therefore there will be more number of teachers and more number of children, and there is a better efficient way of managing and governing the school structures. So there is actually there's some states like Odisha call it the mainstreaming, that the small schools are something actually which needs to be mainstreamed. And the state of Tamil, Telangana calls it a policy of rationalization because it's irrational actually to have a school when the children are less in number. It doesn't economically make any sense. And therefore, various states across India have come up. I think there's no singular state, including Kerala. I think every state had closed down schools, and this was actually very, very rampant. And therefore, I think we can see, and that actually gets into the policy discourse at the national level. There are guidelines for the school closures and mergers. They don't call it closures, but they call school mergers and rationalization. And that actually inevitably comes into the draft national policy and ultimately into the national policy, and it actually takes different kinds of nomenclatures ultimately actually to kind of find coinage and relevance in the contemporary discourses. So therefore, so this is actually happening within a very few years after the implementation of the right to education. And therefore, actually, what is the pretext actually on which the mergers and rationalization process undertaken? Unfortunately, the state takes recourse to the Right to Education Act itself. There is a particular kind of a provision which says that at least 2 teachers are provided to schools with enrollments up to 60. That means actually there must be certain provision of additional teacher if the enrollment is up to 60. But on the contrary, the states began to implement this in terms of if there are 30 children or less, then they are said to be unviable, and therefore they can actually be redeployed to in other schools, so that this idea of 60 2 teachers for 60 children actually can be fulfilled. And therefore, and then actually, if you look at the actual scenario, more than 1.1 lakh single teacher schools exist even today in India. So I think that means all these 1.1 lakh single teacher schools and another actually 1 lakh or double 2 teacher schools are under threat of closure, have already been closed. So this is actually kind of what it actually means actually for us. What it means is that I'll not go into the idea, because the study also looked at whether the merger has actually happened. How does that actually affect the children and the communities? I'm not actually going to look at that. But what I can place before you is that it is definitely a kind of a violation of the right to education. Section 3.1 of the Right to Education Act 2009 stipulates that every child of age 6 to 14 years shall have a right to free and compulsory education in a neighborhood school till the completion of elementary education. It doesn't even talk about the primary education. It talks about the neighborhood school for the entire period of the elementary school. But all these actually closures or mergers, rationalization, mainstreaming has collapsed the very right and the idea of the right. So how does this actually kind of, collapse that idea of neighborhood? Neighborhood is defined in terms of the distance in the policy context of, say, 1 kilometer, which is not sociologically or spatially tenable, and then that therefore the policy winds up all those schools in the respective neighborhoods in the name of mergers. Actually, so sometimes if you look at the spatial distribution of the schools which are closed and which are small in number, in size, you find them actually there in the tribal, isolated, remote forest areas, or within the villages. I think they are slightly away from the so-called the main village. So where the Dalits and the minorities live. So there is actually a kind of spatial segregation, which kind of aids actually certain kind of segregation actually, and that actually impacts. Those are the schools which are impacted by the school closures. So along with that, if you look at the Section 8 of the Right to Education, 8B actually particularly entails the state to ensure availability of a neighborhood school, and 8C actually ensures that the child belonging to the weaker sections and the child belonging to the disadvantaged groups are not discriminated against and prevented from completing elementary education on any grounds. On any grounds, mind that, actually that particular on any grounds. But you see that in the name of this smallness, in the name of unviability, you find the schools are taken away from the neighborhoods of the most disadvantaged sections of the population. So therefore, I think that particular period, the second phase of 2014 to 2019, has brought in several of these, changes that the children began to drop out. So the larger kind of implications of the policy reversal, rather, actually, no, I would rather call it policy reversal or policy inconsistency, actually, so during that particular period. The third phase, actually, of pandemic, 2020 onwards, that inequalities continue, rather accentuated. School closures continued due to the pandemic, brought even those who are attending schools into the net of disadvantage and deprivation. Technology enabled only particular sections to attend even the online education. The state seems to have now appropriated its actions of pre-pandemic era by harping on to new kinds of issues and opportunities it foresees in what is called the online education. What are the larger implications? I will actually try and stop actually here after discussing this particular aspect. If you look at all these three dimensions, yeah. So, what are the larger implications for the idea of equity and social justice? The discussion actually which I presented before you clearly tells us actually that there has been a problem of non-attendance, even an eventual dropout, and inequalities in educational attainments. The attainments of the first phase actually seem to have went downhill, and therefore there is a kind of a receding actually of the gains. School closures pre or post pandemic also mean actually, besides the educational reasons, also means malnourishment, early age at marriage, child labor. Wherever the schools are closed, the girls are married off soon. I think there is a material evidence too on this, and the child labor also seem to be increasing. Probably, I think we are going back to pre-2000 era of the intense deprivations in education. So therefore, I end actually my presentation with one of the iconic statements made by Baba Saheb Bhimrao Ambedkar on 25th November 1949. So what he said on 26th January, just before actually the Constitution was to come in force, he said this: on 26th January 1950, we are going to enter into a life of contradictions. In politics, we will have equality, and in economic and social life, we will have inequality. In politics, we will be recognizing the principle of one man, one vote, and one vote, one value. And in our social and economic life, we shall, by reason of our social and economic structure, continue to deny the principle of one man, one value. And he asks this question: how long shall we live this life of contradictions? And this, I think, is the crux of the question we all need to reflect upon. Thank you so much.
शुक्रिया। अभी प्रोफेसर एस श्रीनिवास राव जी को सुन रहे थे। बहुत सुंदर ढंग से, बहुत नाइसली उन्होंने आर्थिक विकास के साथ शिक्षा पर क्या प्रभाव पड़े हैं और उसमें किस तरह के बदलाव होते गए हैं उसको उन्होंने स्पष्ट किया है और उन्होंने बताया कि किस प्रकार स्कूलों का बंद किया जाना जो नई शिक्षा नीति के आने के बाद तो इतनी तत्परता से और इतने बड़े पैमाने पर शुरू हो गया है कि आश्चर्य होता है कि वह राइट टू एजुकेशन का किस तरह वायोलेशन है और पड़ोस के स्कूल की अवधारणा किस तरह इससे खंडित होती है और हमारे बच्चे जो विशेषकर जो कमजोर और दलित समुदाय के बच्चे हैं हाशिए पर जो है वह हाशिया किस तरह वह मार्जिन ही किस तरह लंबा चौड़ा होता चला जाएगा, पेज है वह सिकुड़ता चला जाएगा। तो शुक्रिया फिर से राव साहब का